So I'm joined by Julia McCabe. And Julia, I've always admired you and admired especially what I see as passion in how you live your life. Like you bring so much passion, and to me, it even feels like devotion to your practice, to life, to your work, to the way you show up, to your friendships. I, I just feel you all in when I'm hanging out with you and when I witness you on social media or in, you know, yoga classes or wherever I see you. I just feel you radiating passion, and what also comes across to me is devotion, and that's always inspired me. So I don't know if that lands for you, if that's your experience of yourself, but that's
Wow,
how,
that is
yeah,
quite an intro. You're
yeah.
hired.
Thanks.
Thank you. That's very generous of you. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm just looking forward to our conversation because I do always enjoy being around you. So I'm intrigued to see where our conversation goes. And it's been really cool to just watch you on your journey as well. And, we know each other from back in the day in Whistler when we were both teaching yoga. And to see you just so committed to ongoingly learning and looking at things from different perspectives, and having recently also dove in deep into doing your master's, I believe, in neuroscience, which congratulations.
I have four more courses to go officially. I just took basically a year off, so I'll be honest about that. Not yet, but
But close.
it's
That
so
alone.
hard. It's so much work. It just makes me want to nap all the time.
I can see why. Yeah, when you told me you were signing up to do it, I was like, "Holy shit, that is commitment. That is hardcore." So kudos to you, because I want to nap and I'm not even close to writing a master's. I want to nap all the time. So
Thank you.
yeah. So I wanted to bring you on today because I want to weave in a little bit more of like the science with the experiential. I am so experiential based. It's sometimes hard for me to retain information and to have more of the knowledge of the science. So I'm intrigued to see how we weave in this, and do this dance of experiential with science, because I also believe you're also more experiential and work more in the energy realm. So it's so cool that you're bringing in science into your practice. Um, to me, you know, science is when we prove that the woo-woo things exist. And it's so cool to have people like you in the field of science while also so tapped into these other realms.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was something that was really important to me. When I was a teacher, we both met when we were yoga teachers, and I was very much all about the energy anatomy, the yogic tradition, the folklore of the roots of yoga, of Jainism and Buddhism and Hinduism, and learning all about the deities and all the things. And when I began to teach people how to teach, teacher trainings in yoga, and I was delivering information on, for example, the chakra system or the energetic mappings that yoga teaches. I had some students who really took to it, and then some students who I could tell went completely over their head. And then I noticed with the change within the yoga world, a desire for people to it was either a hit or miss. So people were either kind of turned off or repelled by energetic yoga speak, and or people were drawn to it. And so it was either or. So I found that um that was an impetus for me to want to go back to school eventually and to basically give people more of a tangible, from the body inside out explanation of what these old ancient teachings were teaching. That was one of my original reasons why I began to learn more about anatomy and physiology. I myself, by nature, am more of an artist. I'm more artsy.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me as I've delved into science and thinking, I'm not a scientist, but I've seen how the two very much mimic one another, and how we are, it's like there's biomimicry within us. Like our lungs are two tipped upside down trees. On a
Totally.
cellular level, we are constantly mimicking nature. We are nature. And that's very artful. It's beautiful. So that's how I love to teach, is how can I take something that is really complicated and difficult and challenging from a neuroscientific perspective and assimilate it or teach it in a way that it's comprehensive and understandable.
That's
And so,
beautiful.
yeah.
Yeah. We need more of that because I find it is really helpful to have more of the analytical understanding of something to support us in the integration of the understanding of what's happening within us, to simplify it in a way where it's relatable and tangible and we get it in more of a whole body way. Like that to me is the art of teaching.
Mhm.
Yeah, so we need more people like you teaching that see the importance of weaving in all of these different realms into the way into the human experience, really, and how we learn.
I can share with you, just this is while I'm on this topic, is something that I'm starting. I have this meditation series coming up. And so this is an example of how I like to weave is I'm weaving in books into the
Ooh, good one.
so it's
Untethered Soul.
untethered soul. So I like to teach neuroscience into a neuro-informed meditation series or neuro-informed breath work. And so I'm going to be having my meditators read, or if they want to read, The Untethered Soul, which is an oldie but a goodie. And so the first chapter, what I love about this book is the first chapter is called The Voice Inside Your Head. And
Ah,
it's his Michael Singer's understanding of, we have a voice inside our head. So right now, if I pause, the listener probably just filled in a sentence or two, like what's she doing, or they just said something to themselves in their head. So we have this voice inside of our head that is constantly being influenced by external and internal experiences. And so there's the beautiful philosophies that come with the books like this, and his
hmm.
understanding of how uh, is every thought that we have 100% true? Well, of course it isn't.
Yeah.
And so you can wake up in the morning and have this thought that is inside your head. And so from his perspective, he says, well, how can if you can challenge it with, well, there are billions of things that are about to happen today, and all these thoughts that are happening in my head, the world is still going to go on and not be affected by any of these thousands of thoughts that are
Hmm.
hundreds of thoughts that I have in my head, and especially the negative ruminative ones. So I love weaving in, this is so philosophical, so beautiful, his book. But then from a neuroscientific perspective, we could say, well, what's happening is I'm kind of obsessed with the default mode network versus the positive task network. So we could look at different networks in the brain and weave in the philosophies of the untethered soul. That's my
Mm.
passion, because if I sit here and just talk about the prefrontal cortex and the cingulate cortex and gyrus, and people will be like, "Oh my
I'm
God,
already sleeping.
yeah,
You already lost me.
I get it." Saying big words, but does that, is it interesting? How can we weave this into making this experience of this novel or a meditation series or a breath work rich with information?
Yeah.
So that really again comes back to my first point of seeing the deficit in teacher training settings, and even in yoga, and how yoga was being delivered.
It sounds like, as many bringing in as many perspectives as possible to really understand the bigger picture of what's at play instead of just being one tracked in the way you teach or in the way someone might learn. It's like, well, let's expand all and bring in as many perspectives as possible.
Yes, and I think it's because people get bored, and including me.
Yes. Yeah.
In order to be an excited teacher, in order to be, for me, a true teacher, I need knowledge, I need
Yeah.
information, I need color and texture and from like cool ways of seeing things. And his untethered soul way of seeing things is very different from other N.A. Judith, there are other different authors in the realm of, wellness. And it, for me, it's number one, am I excited about it? Because if I'm not, then it's going to suck for my students. So,
Exactly.
or it's going to not land. I'm not going to be speaking from, like you pointed out, I like to be passionate about what it is that I'm teaching. Otherwise, it's just boring.
Yeah.
So it's that to me is that, how can you weave a story into everything?
Yeah.
Storytelling is so um, and, dynamic and magnetic, and it's what people connect to. And so if
Yeah.
you can make a story out of the nervous system, then it's fun. It makes it interesting.
Yeah. And it makes people curious. It makes people want to go on their own journey and find and understand their own stories and find their own perspectives of what's going on, right? So I love it.
Yeah.
I would do your teacher training.
It should, or you can.
Right? I know. Re-enter the world of yoga. It's been a while.
Yeah. I've
Yeah.
actually renamed it a modern wellness, yoga therapeutics, and neuroscience training.
Oh, beautiful. I love it. Yeah.
It's like a little bit of everything. So,
Yeah. Beautiful. Love it. So I want to speak a little to, what you're saying here of like continuing to learn, continuing to stimulate yourself as the teacher to then stimulate and expand your students' knowledge. And something that stands out to me in that is the difference in between teaching and staying within the mundane and the familiar versus being in the curiosity of life. And I feel like how I'm kind of weaving this into what I want to speak to next is when we're stuck in a fear state, which a lot of the world is, when we're stuck living in fear, we lose access to that curiosity. We lose access to the play, to the passion, to the connection with learning and connection with each other and connection with nature. And so far, everything you've said is it really allows fluidity of living. And I want to speak on the other end of the spectrum of, where we're lacking fluidity, where we're lacking access to being able to even learn because we're stuck in these fear patterns. Um, and the reason why I want to weave this in is because oh, I think it's, well, I'm having two thoughts right now. One is I think we're speaking too much on trauma and fear and like putting too much energy on that. And that's what's kind of keeping us stuck. But I want to name it in a way because when we bring awareness to how we're stuck in fear or how we're stuck in dysregulation, we can then bring in this part of us that knows what it's like to have passion, to have curiosity, to want to learn, to want to expand, to want to play, to support the parts of us that are stuck in fear to move out of whatever we're stuck in so that we can become more regulated, so that we can, live in a way where we're thriving and not so stuck in these fear states. So I want to speak a little to the fear states and, what's happening within our system with when we're caught in these fear states, while also weaving in what to me is coherence, what to me is flow, what to me is aliveness.
Mhm.
Something I really speak to and work with is like how do we hold the feeling of being alive so that the parts of us that are stuck in survival can remember what it's like to be alive,
Mhm.
right? So when I say fear state, are you open to sharing, and I'll do the same, what to you fear state looks like when you're kind of caught in more of that dynamic, that realm, that world?
Mhm. Well, what comes to mind, because I was just teaching to it this morning on my digital studio, is because it's fresh in my mind, is that we make shapes with our body all the time.
Hmm.
It's actually speaking more or less neuroscience, and but they do blend together, of more of embodiment of our body, and how when we're in the state of fear without us knowing, we make shapes all the time. So by shapes, I mean, um, we harden through the shoulders, we slouch through the chest, we cave in the upper body. We don't realize it, but we're making fists or rigidity or doing weird things with our hands and fingernails. There's a quickening or an acceleration or deceleration of the heart rate. There is the feeling of restlessness in the legs, or we make shapes with our body. We clench our jaw. We harden our eyes. They become piercing or lackadaisical. So where I also like to begin is, instead of working with someone one on one and asking them a million questions and going straight to the neuroscience of things, I might say one or two things, but then have them be in different shapes. So really, I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question right now, but
No, it's great.
the fear state for me shows up in these shapes, and that's what comes to mind right now, is the simplicity of shape making. And how someone says, let's say their desire in life is, I deeply want to fall in love, or I deeply, want to be a more loving human, yet the imprint of I've been hurt, I've been heartbroken is still in the shape of their body. So when
Mhm.
love or loving experiences present themselves, their mind is saying, oh yes, I'm a loving person, yes, I'm welcoming this into my life. However, their body might be crossed arms and a gaze that goes down. And so we know, or some type of fight or flighty type of energy. And so I agree with you in your first statement, is that I think we have, in a way, we've become a culture where the pendulum is swung a little bit, where there's a hyper over pathologizing of, I have this, I have that. And the word trauma has been thrown around so much that I think people are either sick of hearing about it, or trauma talk, even though it's so important.
Mhm.
And so the really, that, to say the word trauma, a trauma response is in the body, is in on that level of the clenching of the fists, or the shutting down, or all the things that we do, a malaise, a sudden extreme fatigue, and from a biological perspective, there's the whole then blueprint of neuroscience on top of this.
Yeah.
So the shape making is a result of, of course, the classic increase or significant decrease of cortisol levels, excessive adrenaline in the system that we have also called, in the umbrella statement, adrenal fatigue. Uh,
Mhm.
Different dysfunctions on a hormonal level. We have more than just sex hormones. We have about 50 hormones in the human body, and so they all weave together when we are speaking about the fear state. And so that is the first thing that comes to mind, is the shape making. And then, from what can we do to unravel those shapes and work with the shapes and undo the fists, and begin to notice, first of all, in the world, when do you start to make these strange shapes? And that's interesting information.
Yeah. I love that. Love that invitation, especially as someone who's more experiential based. It's like, for me, the constant practice of pausing and noticing, what am I experiencing? So bringing the shape of your body into that, to me, is such a great way to just notice, like, oh, I'm squeezing my arms against my ribs, or oh, I am playing with my fingernails, or oh, I'm noticing I'm speaking really quickly right now, right? So I want to even invite people listening to pause and notice their own experience as we're talking, because often when we hear people talking about things, it's bringing awareness to what we do, or we might even find ourselves doing it, or being like, oh my gosh, yeah, I totally do that. And that allows us to have more conscious awareness of what we might do. That's simply an indicator that our system is experiencing some level of stress. And something I speak to a lot is the threat response cycle.
Mhm.
And in a really quick nutshell, it's like, when we feel safe, we're in more of an exploratory state. So where there's curiosity, where there's playfulness, where we see the bright colors, where our muscle tone is softer and able to just be in that fluidity. Our breath is more relaxed, right? And there's this sense of connection to ourselves, to others, to the environment. But as soon as there's a perceived threat, we move into more of that preparatory state where we're prepared in case something is dangerous. And I find lots of people can get stuck in that preparatory state, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm on, I'm alert, I'm hypervigilant, um, I'm flying through this. But from that on alertness, then there's also then the defensive state we can get stuck in, where I'm always on defense, I'm always ready. Um, I'm have some aggression that constantly always wants to be expressed, and that's usually because there's been a thwarted fight or flee response. So I'm kind of got that the defense is on and ready, or I'm shut down and I'm disconnected, right? So to be able to pause and notice, like, oh, I feel that sense of presence and that exploratory state and that ability to connect, or I feel that sense of onness and a little bit of fear in my system, or actually I'm really defensive and protective all the time or in this moment. Like just giving us the opportunity to pause and notice how we're experiencing ourselves gives us information on what's happening in our physiology, what's happening in the way we're wired, the way we're programmed, relative to our environment and relative to what we've entangled as safe or not safe based on our history and based on what we're stuck in. So I love the shape piece as a thing to pay attention to.
Mm.
And
And even to interject there, for those who are listening, is the first step of really embodiment is do nothing except just notice. You don't,
exactly.
and so it's because guess what? All of us are going to experience on a scale of 1 to 10, all of those different things. And some get more stuck in others in the fight or flight, etc. But life is going to continue to happen. And we're all going to continue to have experiences that fill us up and bring us joy. And we'll have those very similar triggers that for some, that will never go away for
Mm-hmm.
maybe for the rest of their life. However, you can learn to become aware of them. And so you can shift and change your response eventually in baby steps to these potential triggers. Just number one, simply through the awareness of them. I can be incredibly fiery, where all of a sudden I can be the calm, cool, collected yoga teacher. And then, for example, like silly things like today, the technology just drives me mad. This is a benign kind of example, but just banal or benign. Did I say the right word? Anyway. Cut that out. But that that it just for sometimes it's just like it just enrages me where I just want to like throw my computer and I just think where is that rage coming from? And that's like a silly example, but in more serious moments of just noticing, wow, that really activated me. Like, where did that come from? And noticing it and still trying to work with it. But sometimes, it can come out of the blue. And so for those who are listening, it's important to just know that uh yeah, just the first step is noticing. And then when you begin to notice it, that's where there's that window of an opportunity to potentially do something a little different next time, or to be preventative of a spiral that's going to take you deeper.
Yeah, exactly. The pause and notice to me is like the practice, pause and notice. And the more we notice, that awareness allows us to create more space around what we're doing. Where are there choice points? Where can we start to recognize another pathway can be created and another possibility can start to unfold? While also recognizing some of our patterns are rooted in something a lot bigger. This is where trauma comes in, right? It's like there's a trauma at the core of the reason why I keep doing this. So I can work with the trauma, but I can also work with reprogramming by noticing and giving myself more space to start to discover other possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think your response to wanting to throw the computer is a total, I can relate to that. Yeah. Um, Something I'm drawn to There's so many things, so many directions we could go. But something I want to geek out about a little bit is the hormonal system. And the reason why I want to weave this in is because I feel like you and I can weave in slightly different approaches to bringing awareness to what's happening at a hormonal level. Obviously, what happens at a hormonal level is really hard for us to actually be aware of. It's like, oh, well, I can actually feel my adrenal glands when they come online a little bit more, but it's like, oh, what's happening in my thyroid right now? Sometimes a little bit hard for us to even make sense of from a scientific perspective. But something that I enjoy doing on my in my own experiences and supporting other people with is like getting curious about these places that are in charge of releasing these hormones and noticing the state that they're in. So just like we just noticed, how do we sense ourselves in more of this fear state, like the positioning for me, I can often feel like if my adrenal glands are on an alert, or if there's something happening in my pituitary and my hypothalamus, like if it feels like it's on and vibrating, that's something that I've trained to pay attention to, and something I weave into my work is like, how do I work with the many different systems and the the quality in which these systems or these glands or these organs are in a way vibrating or not vibrating.
Mhm.
It's not so much, it's not as simple as like, is it vibrating? But noticing the quality in which they are functioning at. So I would love to have you share a little bit of like what's happening in each organ, or excuse me, each gland, so we can become a little more familiar, at least like the endocrine system. There's so many different systems that we could pay attention to. I'm choosing the endocrine system for us to talk about because it's linked to the chakra system, and it's also to me a little more relatable for someone to tune into because some of those glands are glands that we talk about more often and more openly. Not everyone. For some people, this might be totally new information, and then even better, because my intention here is how can we pause and notice these different glands and also weave in some science about these glands so we can both notice the experience and understand their function a bit. And, we could talk probably for hours and, I know you've done a workshop on this before, so I don't expect us to go into great detail, but just I want to play a little in like what's happening in these different levels.
Sure. Okay, some basic anatomy, basic biology that so first of all, the word for listeners listening, the word endocrine, so it's ENDO and CRINE. Endocrine means to secrete within. I think it's Latin or Greek or something.
I like it.
What endo means within, crinin means to secrete. So it's referencing to secrete within your bloodstream.
Hmm.
So every human being has a circulatory system. Our blood is pumped by our heart. We have, the venous and arterial blood supply, and the lymphatic system is also blends in the kind of the weaving of the lymphatic system into the circulatory system. And within it, our bloodstream is through which the endocrine system circulates. So right now, if you're listening to this, you have, you know, many hormones circulating through your bloodstream. I think off the street, someone who has zero anatomy awareness, when you say the word hormone, they just think hormonal, like sex hormones. And so they
Hmm.
equate the sex glands or just, oh, she's she's fertile, he's infertile as being the only hormones in the body. So we have about 50 hormones in the human body. And the neuro part, when you hear the term neuroendocrine, is the connection to your brain. So it connotes, it shows, it points out that we have this bridge of the brain, our neural system, with the endocrine system. So the part of the brain, when we think of the endocrine glands or the structures in the brain that also secrete hormones that are a part of the endocrine system, are the pineal gland, I wish I had a visual right now for everybody because it is very helpful to. I use an anatomy app and we geek out on it. It's so fascinating. But if you look deep to the brain in the limbic system, there's something called the thalamus, and right behind the thalamus sits the pineal gland. And then beneath the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. And then like a little fishing rod stalk at the end of it sits the pituitary gland. So we have the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary. Pineal, by the way, tomato, tomato.
Totally.
So that part within the brain is that neuroendocrine bridge. So from there, the pituitary yoga teachers who are listening heard many times we love to say it's the master gland. I think back into the Bikram
Uh-huh.
days, like pituitary, it's the master gland. And it's very truthful to that, the hypothalamus and the pituitary. The hypothalamus I think is one of the most important, fascinating areas of the brain to know about.
Totally.
And so the pituitary does secrete many of its own hormones that are then conducted and speak to all the other endocrine glands. So if you can think of your biology, the endocrine system is almost like the Wi-Fi system in the human body. And
Mm.
just like a Wi-Fi system, you're talking about, Nicole, how you've got Starlink and sometimes it doesn't work when you're not north facing, you know.
Yeah.
Our endocrine system, our hormonal system is kind of like that. So if we don't get enough sleep, if there's serious stress, we know that we get funky for a reason. And one big reason is that the hormones that are being circulated through our bloodstream, there's either too many or too little, let's say, to
Hmm.
simplify
Hmm.
it. And so we have the brain connection, and then if everyone touches their throat, just in the
Can
throat
I pause you for a sec? Because I almost want to invite people to tune into that area to notice if there's anything they experience. So, so it's kind of like if you go in behind your eyeballs, and I almost like to keep it simple, I almost think like there's a little basket that's holding some of those hormones because anatomically there is a little bit of a like bowl that some of them sit in at least. But just to keep it simple, if you go in behind your eyeballs and uh up a little,
um
down a little.
down a little, yeah,
Yeah.
a
It's
little.
kind of like middle. Like for me, when I find it, I can feel it. I'm just like,
Are you talking
whoop.
about pituitary?
Well, that's the thing. We're kind of flying through them, but
Mm.
the pituitary sits in the little bowl,
Yeah,
correct?
yeah,
So
little low, yeah, it's like the anterior posterior lobes, yeah.
perfect. So let's start there. If we kind of like go back in behind the eyes and down a little, to me, I feel this like little landing pad.
Mm.
And what I'm drawn to there in my own experience is there's a little bit of a pulse that I in this moment feel. So I just want to invite other people to kind of be drawn to this area. You don't even need to anatomically know in this moment. Feel free to go look it up later, but like go back there and just feel what it feels like to just put attention there. Is there anything you notice when you put attention there, Julia?
In this moment, I'm probably overthinking it, and because I'm an interview setting. But if I did know, it feels nice to close my eyes. I will say that. But
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
um, no, I'm not. I can't find it. I think I just need more of an isolated
Yeah,
experience.
that's fair.
Cool. I
This
like
is something I do more
that.
commonly, like more often.
Yeah.
And I just want to invite people into that because I find that we can pay attention to our experience in ways that we don't allow ourselves to. And when we learn to pay attention to our glands, to our organs, to even, our cells in the, I mean, our cells is everything. But when we learn to pay attention at that level, we start to hear or feel or experience the story that lies within those organs or glands or structures. And that's something that I geek out about. So for me, it's like, oh, I can go back and feel the pituitary and feel kind of it sitting there. And for me, there's this rhythm. So something that I'm going to invite us to do is just pause briefly, just to see, like, is there anything you notice when you think about these different areas? And I feel like if we weave in the chakra system as well, it might be too much information. So we'll park that for another conversation unless you do feel the impulse to weave it in. Um, can we just briefly go into the hypothalamus or the penile gland rather
Okay.
and do the same thing?
Okay, sure. So
So,
are we in the interview right now? Are you still
yeah,
doing okay?
yeah.
Okay, cool.
We're still in it.
And
I'm
so
just interrupting you because I want to invite the experiential into this,
uh,
into the knowledge you're bringing. So it's like, there's this information that you're providing around the structure and the importance of the structure and the function of the structure. And I want to invite people to see if they can feel the structure, to feel the gland.
I think so in terms of the pineal gland, you want to think deep to the brain. And something that is really interesting where there has been confusion about the pineal gland is that many people, because it's been coined as the third eye in yoga, they think that it's literally between the eyebrows if
Yeah.
they're aware of anatomy. So the pineal gland is deep to the limbic lobe and it sits behind like the I think of New York the subway station, the big like Times Square, like the or the what's it called where everybody's in New York City and it's like the crazy where all the trains are.
Yeah, I don't know. Times Square sounds right.
Okay. Okay. So it's like the Grand Central Station
Right.
of the nervous system is the thalamus, and behind it is the pineal gland. It is coined as the third eye because I just learned this from Andrew Huberman actually, because he said in nature, in particular birds and snakes, their pineal gland does sit closer
Ah,
to the skull. And in fact, some of them, it looks as though they have an actual third eye because the pineal gland is really close to the surface. The pineal gland, if you have no idea what it's responsible for, is it is mediated by light. So we know that it produces in us humans melatonin to induce sleep. So when there's a decrease of daylight, the pineal gland will secrete melatonin as around 9 o'clock, let's say 8, 9 o'clock. And so um, some creatures like snakes and certain birds, they have it where it actually does look like a third eye.
crazy.
Us humans, our third eye is deep to the brain. It's deep to behind the thalamus. And however, what is really interesting because when we meditate and we focus, we say the third eye, focal point to the third eye. It's an area that is beautiful to focus on because we know as well that the actual surface of the brain has no pain receptors. So it's an area of the brain that is beautiful to focus on for meditation because it lacks pain, which I
Interesting.
mean, this is kind of like a cool deviation from, but I
Yeah.
just the pineal gland has been talked about over and over again. And, I know Joe Dispenza loves to talk about squeezing the perineum. So that changes the fluid, the cerebral spinal fluid, and creates more pressure to the pineal gland, and that there's crystals in the pineal gland. And it's just, you could go on and on, in terms of the esoteric speak around it. Um,
Mhm.
but I thought I'd offer that for the listeners to think that it's a little bit deeper. It's not between the brow.
Beautiful.
And
Yeah.
you can just think about going kind of deep midbrain. And if you can imagine like a big oval shaped ish kind of structure, the thalamus, and then sitting behind the thalamus. And when I teach people to be in meditation, I'll cue them to close your eyes and like you're sitting in the middle of the brain.
Mm.
And then you back up a hot second. So you back up a little bit, and then
Yeah.
I guess you could then induce, you could do your, can you feel the vibration of the pineal gland?
Yeah. Exactly.
Mm.
Yeah. Beautiful. So there's another thing for someone to pause and notice. Like, can you notice that as Julia's talking about it? Can you find it within your own brain? And can you notice what you experience when you put attention on it? I know for me, it feels different than my pituitary gland. It feels more expansive. It feels like it's like vibrating outward, whereas the pituitary had a pulse to it for whatever reason in this moment. Whereas I can feel like the back of my brain expanding. I feel my brain stem expanding with it. I feel space in my ear canals as I'm bringing attention to it. And there's like my brain, I feel my brain like softening in my skull a little bit as I'm paying attention to it.
Now, that's in terms of sensitivity to the body. I just want to point out that's advanced. Like
Very advanced.
what you're actually asking the listeners to do right now is
Yeah.
very advanced. And
Yeah.
so I think that, and I don't mean to, this is no at all
No.
insult to you, but I think that a lot of people will be like, I'm not listening to this anymore. Or they're like, I can't feel my vibrating or pineal gland. And so it's
Totally.
advanced, So I
Yeah.
think it's why before I would do that or offer it up, I want to show, tangibly like where, because people need to kind of see it. So to experience it and to kind of guess.
Some people do.
Some people do. I know that
Yeah.
my brain needs that where I'd be in the
Yeah.
and therein lies the yoga world where things would just be like, I don't know where anything is. So
Yeah.
it's advanced, dude. You can feel your pineal gland vibrate. Good for you.
Well, and that's it. That's what I want to weave into
Yeah.
all my podcast episodes is the invitation for people to discover that we are so much that more than we perceive,
Yeah,
right? And
exactly.
I'm sharing what I'm experiencing as an invitation for people to discover their own potency by
Mm.
learning to pay attention. And I in no way expect those listening to be able to find it, but what would it be like to at least be curious about the experience of the many layers that are at play. Right?
And that alone, it opens up such a massive gateway to the capacity to heal oneself.
Totally. 100%.
If you can get so attuned to feeling deeply into the pineal gland, into pituitary, which you can do, which we can all do,
Yeah.
you imagine what happens when, the possibility of healing, of if you're in a healing crisis right now, if you're,
Yeah.
going through a cancer treatment, like the observation of deep, really the medicine of this is what you're offering is really beautiful.
Well, and what's really interesting for me, at least, is I have some massive fibroids, and it's really hard for me to pay attention
Mm.
to anything in my pelvis. Not so much anything. I can pay attention to certain layers of my pelvis, but where I require healing, where there's congestion, let's say, where there's lack of coherence, where there's um dysregulation, to use the words I throw around often, right? It's hard for me to pay attention to.
Mm.
So it's where I have organization, where things are in flow, more inflow is, it's ongoing. It's easier for me to pay attention to those things. And to me, that's information. It's like, oh, okay, I can access this. And how do I find that which is working? How do I find that pleasure, that joy, that passion, that creativity, that aliveness to support the things that are not that, to recognize that coherence exists, that something else is possible within the areas that are stagnant, that are stuck, that are limited, that are um, dysregulated.
Mhm. Mhm. Very
Yeah.
cool.
So, and we got a little off track there, and I'm also mindful of time. I'm like,
There we go.
so are you, how about for now, we'll leave it at that from the experiential practice, and I'll just get you to describe the other parts of the endocrine system since that's the topic we were on. And then I just invite other people or those listening to pause and just notice if something is speaking to you as Julia's talking about these different areas, see what it's like to just pause and notice what you're experiencing. Because that's information for you to gather and learn more about yourself from. And it's to me, it's what comes from that awareness is really where the richness and the real healing can happen.
Yeah, you might have an intuitive hit like, oh, maybe I should get my thyroid levels tested. Or, I think that women, especially, they have not to be biased, but just there's a sensation of, I feel like my iron is low. We sometimes say these statements without really knowing where they're coming from,
Yeah.
or I feel like something is off, and so as I'm saying these areas where you have structures of the endocrine system in you, if you get a little bit of a sensation or a hit, or um, whether it's a really strong quality, like you feel like the area throbs a little bit, or there's a pulsation, or it feels you like kind of dissociate, like Nicole was just talking about the pelvis, is that it feels clunky or hard to be in. Like there's different descriptive words that might pop up where it's like, oh, my throat feels raspy, or I feel, well, in the throat area, we'll start there. So we just run the brain. So down below we have the fourth of the endocrine system structures, which is the thyroid, and it wraps around, if you swallow, kind of around the Adam's apple area. It's like a big butterfly shaped gland. So the thyroid, it secretes its own glands, its own hormones, pardon me, as well as into the bloodstream, into other endocrine glands. Uh, Something for women, especially to who are listening, is that it is very common for women to have more of the hypothyroidism, being a sluggish, underactive thyroid. And so, experiences of, I mean, they're blanket experiences that could be other things or symptoms like fatigue, or, brittleness of hair and hair loss and sudden weight gain and extreme fatigue, and all of these things could account for other things. But if that, and then if you look up the list of hypothyroidism, it's definitely good for women, especially to get their thyroid levels tested with
Mm.
both a doctor and a naturopath, or someone who is much more nuanced in reading the levels of hormones. So hypo, or also hyper, is becoming more common, where there's excessive weight loss, excessive like anxiety comes with that, a lot of um, desire to move, like almost like a hyperactivity in the system. So you want to get thyroid levels tested. So if you pause and you just, I think of this area actually as being quite exposed, because it's just such
Mm.
thin skin. And, maybe because I'm a teacher, I'm always talking all the time. I always feel like my thyroid could use some support. Um, just off the top of my head, it makes me think of all of the electronic devices that we have, and how it's potential, how they are being, the hormone levels, or the areas like the throat, etc., are being influenced by technology. And is it called EMFs?
Yeah, exactly.
It just comes to mind. It's like why we want to speak on a speakerphone instead of, old school being on a phone.
Yeah, totally.
That comes to mind. So if you have a sensation of the throat, just notice your throat now, and the thyroid and thyroid gland, and just notice what comes to mind. Pausing here, Nicole.
Pause and notice.
And then going down, if you thump everybody just feel your collarbones, and then thump the top of your chest, and there is the sternum. And so right behind the sternum, there's a gland that is also, it also gets grouped in with the lymphatic system. We have the thymus gland. Now, by the time that as soon as we become late teenagers, early 20s, it actually starts to shrink. And by the time we're by 60 years old, the thymus gland actually is mostly adipose tissue. So it actually
Crazy.
is really, really depressing.
Yeah,
But
poor thing.
it's the most abundant when we look at little kids, their thymus gland versus somebody who's 60, it's virtually gone. So
Mm.
it very much, when I think about the thymus gland, it's responsible for laying the groundwork when we look at the immune system and fighter T cells, and different hormones that are responsible for immunity. And a little bit of the energetics, it sits right above. So if you feel your collarbones and then go down, it's the top of the sternum. So the manubrium of the sternum, manubrium.
Yeah, no idea.
Right behind there is the thymus, and then when you thump your chest, it's called the thymus thump. The when you thump
Mm.
your sternum, and it sits right above the heart. And so also behind your heart, you have this big, beautiful structure of the heart. And so the heart, and a little bit of energetics, the heart is love, unconditional love. And when we look at immunity and our immune system, it is very much in relationship with, do we feel loved, do we feel supported? If you look at the development of a baby, like a newborn baby, depends upon the warmth, the cooing, the cawing, the feeling of a human taking care of it. And we know that the groundwork for the immune system is laid then. So it's very much an association with the feelings of love. And we know that when
Mhm.
we feel lack of love, we're much more vulnerable to be getting sick, etc. So maybe even though some of your thymus glands may have shriveled up by now. You thump the thymus, there's this idea that if you thump it enough, it kind of energetically awakens it. It's the gland that I know least about, so I'm sure some listeners know much more about the thymus gland, but it's really interesting. I'd be curious to see research looking into the thymus gland and longevity and
Yeah.
why we're not immortal.
Well, I feel like it's one of the glands that we speak of the least. Like most people don't even know that that exists. Like
Yeah,
the others,
yeah,
are words that are thrown around and you kind of hear them. But thymus, I feel like, yeah, it doesn't get spoken too much.
exactly.
Yeah, which is weird because it's like so rooted in our health.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can even just pause if you want to. You can put your hand on the top of the sternum and even just thinking of your own health and immunity for the listeners. And if your immune system has, been struggling, and if there's any kind of relationship to the perception of love or lack of love, it'd be an interesting connection to make, or just noticing sensation in the upper chest.
Hmm. What I find interesting too, just as we're moving our way down, it's like when we pay attention to one, to also notice what's happening above and below.
Mm.
Where is there communication and flow, and where is there a block and a disconnect? Because that alone, again, is something we can become aware of. So for me, I know my thyroid feels more offline or a little muddled and harder for me to grasp,
Yeah.
whereas the thymus is very easy for me to grasp. So I can notice above and below my thymus or my thyroid, I mean. So I can notice my sternum and my brain to keep it simple. And it's like above and below feel more organized, but my thyroid feels a little less. So I'm kind of like aware of where there's organization and aware of where there's less. And even as I say that, I can notice my thyroid coming a little bit more online.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see research into being that the thymus gland is the most abundant when we're little kids. And I'm curious, I'm actually it's to me surprising that there's not a lot of talk around early childhood development, immunity, and the role of the thymus gland as much as
Yeah.
possible, because we talk so much about the the vagus nerve or the polyvagal,
Adrenal glands and
or just the laying of a healthy foundation of how as kids we're impacted by experience and how that's impacting certain parts of the body. And it's interesting to me that we don't look at, let's say, a child who's been deprived of proper love also equates to a faulty immune system. Does
yeah.
does a faulty thymus gland have something to do with that?
Yeah.
Thymus wasn't strong and abundant from childhood onward, and it begins to shrivel up into late teenage, early 20 years. Then, what happened in those early years that then potentially sets that person up later on in life to have um, a fragile immune system?
Yeah. It's a great question. You can write your next paper on it.
Yeah. So do you want to keep going down?
Sure. Yeah.
So, so then if you place your hands like into it's harder for this one to see your pancreas, which is, the pancreas is one of the sneaky endocrine organs because it's also part of the digestive system. So it secretes it secretes its juices into the digestive system, but it's also secreting insulin. So it has its role in the production of insulin. So we know that, for example, a disease of the endocrine system of the pancreas is diabetes. So someone who, whether you're born with it or in many cases it's diet related. So someone who's, had a really, really profoundly, um, high sugar, high lots of everything we see in the States, especially there's a pandemic of diabetes unto itself.
Yeah.
So we see that individuals with diabetes, they eventually have to get insulin shot. They have to do the insulin shots, maybe what, 2 or 3 times a day kind of thing.
I think so. Yeah.
And so the pancreas sits, I always think it looks like a big long fish, like a squished fish.
Totally. And to me, it always feels like cottage cheese. Like
Yeah.
that's the feeling to me. It's like, oh, there's the cottage cheese.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is, the reason why pancreatic cancer often goes undiagnosed is because it does sit so deep behind ish the digestive system. So whereas if there are tumors, etc., you can't palpate it. You can't.
Mm,
That's my understanding of why that gets missed. Um, and so it's this insidious cancer. And so when we think about the pancreas, and I also think of, where we store things like the energy of anger and spite
yes.
and unresolved crap. I think of these deep, kind of bottom dweller organs,
Totally. Totally. They're in the darkness.
dark and yet so important. And
Yeah.
so the pancreas, if you just sit for a moment, you take a big breath in. So it sits a little bit more to the left, kind of we've got the stomach, and if you can think of it being kind of deep behind there, right? So take a deep breath in or feel into your deep left lower abdomen, or more so to the stomach, it's not too low. Okay, and then you can even like move your ribs around and like kind of feel into like what is the energy in and around the belly, the stomach, the deep left side. Nicole, how does it resonate for you?
For me, this feels like I can feel the cottage cheesiness. I think I learned that word. One of my teachers, Kathy Kane, she works with the endocrine system in similar ways that I'm kind of weaving in here. And yeah, she described it as cottage cheese. And I was like, yes, that's it. And to me, there's a depth to it, but there's a warmth to it. I'm noticing a warmth. And it's interesting because right below it, it's like the deep black hole of my pelvis, but above like the actual pancreas to me feels like alive and vibrant and warm and cottage cheese-ish. Yeah, and it's interesting just noticing the contrast of like where that ends and then the awareness of everything that, well, not everything, but kind of what feels more jumbled up for me in the um, what's the word I'm looking for? See, I can't even find the word. The thing you make babies with, not my uterus, but the reproductive system. That's the word I was like, see, that's how offline it is.
I was gonna say, in this area, not just the pancreas, but for a lot of people, like this, just the solar plexus, the whole gut brain axis in total chaos. And if you asked me at the start of fight or flight and being in fear state, and if there's one area that just, I think especially with diet and increase in sugars and all the things, it's the gut brain axis. And we're healing lots about the microbiome and what is happening on a neural level too, in the neuroendocrine system, but also in the lining of the GI tract and the intestines and stomach and that whole connection. So for listeners, if you feel like, oh, like a lot of people just feel like it's, words like sticky or bloated or kind of chaotic, or it's been an area where you feel, and I talk about students who are incredibly interoceptive, like Nicole, you're like next level interoceptive, where you have such inner body sensation, and some individuals who are listening who are next level exteroceptive, meaning they're very, very aware of everything beyond their skin. So they're very aware of sight, or like the external sensory information coming in. Whereas somebody who's very interoceptive is someone who eats a piece of food, can feel it go down their esophagus, can feel the moment that it hits their stomach, can actually feel and track their food, especially individuals who've had to go through illnesses or, deal with allergies, etc., or gut issues. This area is very, very also very sensitive. So it's not just pancreas, but it's all of the digestive system that comes into play here.
Yeah, totally.
People. Um, Now, what's really interesting is the adrenals is kind of it is what comes next. Yet when we look at the energy anatomy, it's the first one. So it's always funny because when we what we haven't really talked about is the energy mapping of the chakras. And what's really interesting for those of you who are interested, Google chakras and Google endocrine organs, and you'll see that they physically line up in these really beautiful colorful charts that people do in yoga anatomy and animation. And so old yogic history looked at the mapping of the energy systems, and what we now see 3,000 years ago is it's exactly where these endocrine organs live. But the ones,
So cool.
it's so cool, it's so interesting. But the ones that don't match up are the adrenals. So if everybody can just brings your hands, you can bring your hands to your lower back. You could even take fists and like thump into the lower back and know that deep to the low back-ish area, we have our kidneys. So think about two massive kidney beans in your body. And then on top of the kidneys are, I think of two little toques on top of
Yeah.
that look like Canadian toques or hats.
Little
Uh,
beanies, little hats. Yeah.
and those are the adrenal glands. And so the adrenals secrete from the cortex, we see the secretion of cortisol. And from the medulla, which means middle, we see the secretion of adrenaline. And so we have those two major hormones that most people listening will know, like when you talk about adrenaline or you get a hit of adrenaline, or you're an adrenaline junkie, we're talking about that surge of that whoa, you feel that rush, right?
Hmm.
Cortisol is also made and had kind of been this sinister, made the news, has gotten a bad rap, but cortisol is an essential hormone, meaning we'd be dead without it. And
Hmm.
so if you bring your palms into your lower back and you just breathe into your lower back or make light fists and thump into your lower back, just notice, like, how are your adrenals doing? How's your cortisol levels? How are your adrenal levels? And notice if there's any messages from your body from this area.
When I was first learning about all of this, and again, this is Kathy Kane's work. We do a lot of work with kidney adrenals. I remember being like, I can't find them, can't find them. And this is where I really learned you don't need to know where they are or need to necessarily feel them, but the power of putting attention somewhere and just holding an intention of like, hey, I want to connect and I'm curious about what's happening here. Information just starts coming through, and it took me a long time to be able to access kidney adrenals, other areas a lot easier. Whereas, and this is something I would do in personal sessions and I teach in my programs, like it is learning how to connect with everything we're talking about right now. But um it's so cool when people land in recognizing their adrenal glands and it's or even their kidneys. It's like, whoa, I've had people be like, oh, it feels like an old man sitting in a rocking chair reading a newspaper. Or the other one's like, oh no, it's like wide awake and alert and like will not rest and hot and sweaty over there, like it's amazing what comes out of people's mouths when you actually pay attention to these weird things that it doesn't necessarily need to make sense, but it's like, well, there's an experience there, and that allows me to learn more about myself. It doesn't need to make sense. You don't need to like know what's happening, but see that as like, oh, interesting. Something's there, and that's new information, you know?
Well, it's like some kind of there's a sensation like the old man in a rocking chair, like just it that translates as I'm tired. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Exactly.
Sensation. So it's like that weird visual is the body's interesting message to you. And that's why when I because kind of started with this and said if you get a strange hit, like uh, the area feels fuzzy or damp, or I feel like I need to eat red meat, or I don't want to eat red meat, or my throat is telling me I need water, or I need to, these weird hits that our body gives us is it's pretty cool because
It's
often
so cool.
accurate and it's good information, like you say.
Yeah, totally.
The adrenals, when Nicole and I were just talking about the mapping of the energetics, is that why it's the first, we talk about the first chakra, and getting back to the theme of Nicole talking about being in a fear state is the first chakra in yoga language is all about safety, family. These are my people. It is in development. The idea is development from conception to the first year of life. And so we know that when we come out for the first 2 or 3 years, we're quite useless. We need the help of other humans. We come out of the womb completely alien to the world and we can do nothing for ourselves. We need to be fed, we need to be given food, all the things. So, of course, that makes sense on a primal level when we have not been taken care of, or there's a sense of urgency, or if there's some type of birthing trauma. The idea is that there's that little bit of history to
Mhm.
this first year experience. In the rest of our life, it has to do with that. Like, am I safe? Are my feet planted on the ground? And so we know that the adrenal system, we have that fast loop and slow loop of, when we look at the HP axis versus the SAM axis, if you want to Google those two accesses and compare them, we know that that energy or a lot of what's going on here is the function of the adrenals. And
Yeah.
so, adrenal fatigue, another way of understanding it, is when someone has too much adrenaline. Excessive adrenaline is quite common, and that leads to feeling exhausted and feeling or having exploding and you don't know why, and having a temper, or cortisol. Excess cortisol has a corrosive effect on all the other organs and glands. So feeling extremely depleted or getting sick. We know that that is associated with I don't feel safe. I don't feel at home. I don't trust these people. I don't trust this environment is all very is in cohesion with the mapping of the chakra system.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
what is fascinating about the chakra system is that they didn't have anatomists 2, 3,000 years ago, or neuroimaging, or fMRIs, or X-rays to understand any of this. There's just
Yeah.
a, like rudimentary anatomy that they were dealing with. It's
Yeah.
pretty.
Comes back to, it's magic until science proves it otherwise, and then it's science. It's like it's so cool the knowledge that was there so long ago that we're now able to put science to yeah, prove the wisdom that was there so long ago.
And then I think we just have the sex organs left.
Yep,
It's
that's it.
the bowl of the pelvis, and this is also very like a hot spot for people
Hmm.
have often disconnect. And so we have the ovaries and testes, so the secretion of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, all the sex hormones. And I think these hormones are the most relatable because a our society is obsessed with sex, sexuality. Also, right now, women and fertility issues. Um, More women are having babies at later ages, so IVF and different women working with healthy fertility into their sometimes mid 40s is becoming more and more common, and having babies, even up to 45. So it's really interesting to see that, and also the issues that we're having with sex hormones and sex and sex hormones. It's again, it all kind of weaves into this undercurrent of what our society has been really kind of either paying too much attention to, or there is um, you know um, or through, oh God, I don't even want to add on the layer of like, I don't want to say the P word, patriarchy. No, a
And it
distance
all has impact.
or flattening energy of
Yeah.
healthy understanding of sex and sexuality. And
Yeah.
so there's so much funkiness in the pelvis. And we look at the energy of the pelvis, and the pelvic bowl is creation. So
Exactly. Creativity and creation, right?
literally the creation of a human being comes out of
Yeah.
the pelvis. So there's a lot there. And so the energy of yes and no and boundaries and pleasure. And I think there's a deficiency of how important it is for us to be in our pleasure. like
Mhm.
to see pleasure as actually to live within a as a principle in your life. We really cut it off in our culture. Like, nope, no, you're not allowed to have pleasure only on the weekends, and
Yeah.
then drink your face off or whatever and do it over 2 days. And then you have to be back into structure. So the movement of the hips and the pelvis we see in yoga, and it's why so much comes up for people. Is there's this kind of element of water that is an association with the pelvis and movement and flow, and the opposite is rigidity and confinement and a lack of pleasure and a dissolving of you know imprisoned femininity within the pelvis, for both regardless of your gender. So this kind of strange area that is both cultural and political, and it all kind of comes into the pelvis as well. And yeah, so when you breathe into your pelvis, and when you take your energy all the way down to your pelvis, and one way to connect with it is to squeeze the muscles, the perineum, or we know in yoga we call this the root, or the Kegel muscles or the Mula Bandha, as one way to kind of feel into this area. So you could do that few times, or just breathing awareness and spaciousness in between your two hips. And just notice a sensation, messages, energy. What do you feel, Nicole?
Yeah, for me it's a big void. There's movement to it. But it's hard for me to put like I can feel the outside of it. I can feel the edges of it, but for me to put my attention inward feels like I get lost in it. Like there's a lot of energy in there. Yeah. And if I can pay attention to the edges of it, for me, it's like I can stay with it. I can almost like hold space for it, or it's like I'm with it instead of lost in it. And then as soon as I go inward, I get lost in what to me feels like, ugh. Um, yeah, there's some deep diving for me to ongoingly be doing in here. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed when you're doing that, when I'm cueing you to do it, you actually do it with your eyes open, which is really
Yeah.
interesting.
I do most of my inquiring eyes open.
Okay.
If I close my eyes, yeah, it's for me, eyes open, I'm able to tune into my experience more. When I do eyes closed,
Too much.
it's not that it's too much. I think I really enjoy eyes open because I still feel like I'm here. And when I do eyes closed, I can get lost in the experience kind of thing. Yeah.
And the reason why I'm asking this is a really important element of, I was just speaking of like meditation, and how for some people, eyes or and breath work, how eyes open is really helpful and eyes closed is not helpful, and vice versa. Many people like to do breath work with eyes closed, but something that I teach in my training, and my breathwork training is eyes open is, and if you feel like you stay more in your body with eyes open versus you close your eyes and you kind of float away and dissociate, is a sign of that excessive interoceptive versus exteroceptive. So in a
Right.
way, Nicole,
Yeah.
it makes sense for you that because you're incredibly interoceptive, in that you are able to do that with your eyes open because you're so attuned.
Totally. Yeah.
So, and I was just curious because I thought, wow, that's cool that you can do that
Yeah.
with eyes open, and you're not.
Yeah. It's almost like it keeps me here. Like I can with when I because I do some practices eyes closed, and when I go eyes closed, I can go very esoteric.
Yeah.
So I can also dissociate, but it's more that I go esoteric and then I enter other realms. So if my eyes are closed, I am noticing I have more dimensional experiences. Um, so yeah, there's so much there for me. Eyes open, eyes closed.
Okay.
Yeah, and the places I can go.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, this has been a lot, and I'm so grateful for your guidance and your knowledge. And something we didn't get to, and I'm going to, I mean, you're welcome to speak to it to, still if you want to, but something we didn't get to is the evidence of how things like meditation and breath work can change your state and can change the way you're wired. What I'm going to encourage is for people to do your programs. You've got a meditation program coming up. I know you offer them a couple times a year. You've got teacher trainings, you've got retreats. I think you're still doing retreats, one retreat a year. Is that true?
June, February of 2025. And
Yeah. So I'm going to invite people to, if what Julia's sharing and you're curious about breath work and meditation, like Julia, I'm pretty picky with who I suggest people te work with because to me, there's lots out there that lacks knowledge and a sense of how to hold a safe container to do these types of explorations. But yeah, I definitely suggest people check your offerings out. Is there anything you want to add to both what you have coming up, but also just meditation, breath work, the benefits of it?
yeah, well, in terms of my actual offerings, I have, trainings coming up. I'm working one-on-one with people. I've got like, I do 3 6 month, 1 year one-on-one. So in the form of either internship or mentorship slash a little bit of coaching. Um, and yeah, so it's kind of this, I'm like a slow moving ship in terms of it's not just yoga, it's many things of how my career has evolved. Um, and yeah, I like to keep it fun as well, in
Mhm.
terms because like this can get so academic or so intense or so heavy or serious that it's important for me to have a laugh while I'm teaching. I have to.
That's one thing I love. Yeah. You're
Uh,
always, yeah, totally.
Oh, and humor and connectivity and storytelling and giving people space to share their stories because I'm equally intrigued by who shows up to work with me has been really a part of, my offerings is it's colored by the people who show up. And so, yeah, I've got the August, I have an 8 week meditation series that's happening pretty soon here. And then in September, we begin a 300 hour. We spend 2 weeks of that in Nicaragua, or it's 100% online. I have my digital studio, which is a platform that is abundant with practices that you could literally subscribe to now and do them right now if you wanted to. I'm pretty proud of that one. I've designed it, really built it up. It's a massive library, and I still teach it every morning live.
Amazing.
Well as it's like a Netflix basically of all my teaching for the last 4 years. It's
That's
massive.
incredible.
And it's breath work, embodiment, movement practices, traditional, good old school like vinyasa, kicking a butt, restorative practices, a little bit of everything. So yeah, I've got like many different tendrils out into different ways of teaching and of being in studentship as well. So
Beautiful.
yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I definitely am inspired to come explore some of your practices. So you
Well,
might see me soon.
yeah, it would be amazing to have you.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much, Julia. I so appreciate all the knowledge. And
Mhm.
hopefully people have new insights, both from an experiential perspective and from an understanding of what the heck is going on in one of the many systems that's driving how we show up as humans.
For sure. Thank you very much for having me.
No problem.
Mm.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope that this episode has provided you with new perspectives and insights. And if you haven't already, head to my website to download the experiential guide. Until the next time, I invite you to continue to pause and notice.